The blending of 70s funk with the emerging hip-hop culture and synthesizer technology in the early 80s produced a musical style known as electro. But what seemed to be a brief fad for the public was in fact a fertile breeding ground for a new generation of musical innovators. This spotlight on the original sounds of the 70s led directly to the birth of the rare groove scene, where racially mixed groups met in warehouses and Soho clubs. They embraced a mixture of fashions and tuned their car stereos to the plethora of new pirate radio stations.
My abiding memory of a good night out is emerging into sort of Old Street or King's Cross area in about 6 in the morning, and you'd look down at your feet and your feet would be this sort of muddy grey colour because they'd just be clogged with concrete dust and sweat. And it was almost in proportion to, you know, how filthy you were, how good the night would be.
There's something about funk, there's something about that rawness, the emotion, the soul in that music that makes you want to move, that makes you want to react, that makes you want to feel good. It still works now.
It's a mad thing about music and soul music. You can think you've got it all covered, but there's always going to be something out there that's just going to go, you're just going to go, wow, what is that? Rare groove really is like rare records, rare funk. I mean, where it started, I'd say really was around, well, in the early 80s really, from warehouse parties. It was a basic thing of where I think a lot of nightclubs at that time, in, say for example in central London, were really not keen of having a mixed crowd of people. They'd be more of a discotheque.
The whole rare groove phenomenon was basically the first hyped black lifestyle, basically. It was for the first time all the main players in it, who were by and large black, were getting acknowledgement by the white music and style press.
The whole thing about rare groove was that they were hard to find, and if you wanted to hear those records, you had to go and hear those DJs.
There wasn't one presiding sound that you could define as being rare groove, although James Brown was kind of an influence and soul music was an influence as well. But there wasn't a sort of defining sound. It was all about the big sort of jigsaw that was created by little pieces of music being put together in some pioneering clubs.
For me, in the beginning, it was just a working title to describe records that weren't readily available anymore. These were regular records that I enjoyed in my youth and before that.
Well, come the time, come the man, and Norman was just the figure. I mean, for a lot of different reasons, he had this thing that he'd collected 10,000 records. You know, the soul scene had always been about buying the new records, but here was someone that had bought a lot of stuff at the time, but then gone back and bought all the things he'd missed. So he just had this incredible record collection.
Actually, I know Norman J as Papa, and that's what I call him. And I call him Papa because he's the originator from the scene, from the whole soul scene as far as I'm concerned.
Rare groove just actually took over. We were so naive when we opened the shop, and it really was about just providing us with an alternative music source. And the more we went over to America and delved into these records, we were discovering, you know, all James Brown, who we'd heard of, but we'd only ever heard of Sex Machine. And all of a sudden there was all this whole Horny Horns and Fred Wesley and, you know, the whole thing that went with it. We was picking up all these amazing records and bringing them back just to play in the club, play to ourselves and sell at the shop. And then I actually found a few other people were into this. All of a sudden all these guys started turning up to the shop, you know, like Norman J and Giles Peterson and RS Digital and Femi, Jazzy B, and it was, wow, you know, why are they so into this music? And then we got into the whole pirate radio thing and realised that this whole scene was exploding around us. So suddenly my shop, Quaff Records, became the rare groove shop in London because we had all these records that we were naively just going to buy anyway.
The daytime playlists of mainstream stations, by their very nature, could never appeal to an underground audience. So Britain has had a long tradition of pirate radio, dating back to Radio Luxembourg and Radio Caroline in the 1960s. By the 80s, gangs of intrepid entrepreneurs built transmitters and located them on convenient tower blocks, playing a constant game of cat and mouse with Department of Trade officials. The most popular by far was London's Kiss FM, who first provided airtime for the music of Norman Jay and his original Rare Groove show.
There was nothing on the radio at that time that really gave you what you wanted. There was virtually no black music on Radio 1. Capital had a hip-hop show which was introduced by Mike Allen, who must have been about 50 at the time. Radio London had a couple of shows. So you just couldn't get to hear all this brilliant music that was coming out. And the Pirates came along and they were brilliant, and I think that was part of the attraction, was that you turn on the radio and you wouldn't know whether they'd been busted, you wouldn't know whether they were going to be there or not. And the things you used to have to do to get a signal. I lived up in Mill Hill, right up in the tip of North London, and I remember listening to Norman's show, holding the aerial, so I would become an extension of the aerial, because that was the only way that I could get a decent signal.
I mean, in the early days of Kiss, I can remember it was like Gordon Mack who started the whole thing up, and I can remember with me, Gordon and Norman Jay, climbing up on rooftops in Charlton, putting aerials up, and it was that, we had like 3 aerials in the back of the car, and if one got nicked, we had another place to put the other one up, and we had this the decks were set up in what could only be described as a bit of a squat, really, and there was always a fear that you were going to get the tap on the door. But it was cloak and dagger, and you did feel a little bit excited about it then.
There was no 5-year plan for Kiss FM. We got on air, and every minute, every record that we put on that we stayed on air and wasn't busted was a bonus to us, and that's how Kiss FM started, really. I mean, it's a bunch of DJs that wanted to disc jockey on the radio and play their music to the world.
We wanted to start a weekend station playing black music, which was an alternative to the other pirate stations playing soul and jazz and funk, but more importantly to give an opportunity to unheard of, untried, untested young black as well as white DJs an opportunity to broadcast.
Kiss FM was significant in that it was a pirate with a difference, and I think the problem with pirates, both then and now, is that they tend to go for very obvious genre choices. At the time, the pirates all played reggae. Now, if you want to listen to a pirate station, they'll mainly play sort of UK garage. Kiss FM went through an incredibly broad cross-section of different areas of dance music from their pioneering phase onwards. And it was it really was the kind of the village voice, the focal point for both the rare groove community and the burgeoning club culture that was existing in London at the time. And really nobody was more important on that station than Norman Jay. For many people, Norman Jay was Kiss FM. He really did. He had a unique discursive style where he'd almost speak for 5 minutes of a record that might last 7 minutes, but what he had to say was so relevant and was so devoid of the bullshit that the sort of Tony Blackburns, who were pioneering soul music on conventional radio at the time, were full of, that it just had a freshness and really did represent the music that meant something to our social scene.
Kiss FM was the main pirate radio station in London and had a real fantastic roster of DJs, and you would always hear really good music there because it would be people that were really into what they were playing and actually choosing. They didn't have a playlist then, so they were playing what they wanted to hear, which is basically what the people wanted to hear, and that's why it became so popular.
I came on air a week after the station started, and I had to think of a title for my show. And I just thought, well, a lot of the old records I've got, some of them are quite rare, quite valuable. Not all of them in the true sense of the word, but at that particular time they were. And I thought, and it was deliberate, that I would call my show the original Rare Groove Show.
The lovely thing about pirate radio was when you sat there in your car, you actually felt part of a select community. You didn't actually think, God, 13 million other people could be listening to this. You felt like, God, it's, a couple of hundred of us listen to this and no one else knows anything about it. And there was a romance and excitement in that. It was as I said, irresistible.
Oh, I did feel quite rebellious for listening to Kiss, but also we used to actually go down there to wherever they were like broadcasting from, so you kind of felt that any minute it was going to be raided. If they were going to come in, then you'd be ready to sort of fight them and, you know, run away with the records. And, you know, it was quite, you did feel quite subversive.
When we first came on back in '85, we had about a month where we wasn't busted, which was great for us because it meant that we could build up a really good, solid listenership. But then, once they sort of got their claws into us, the DCI this is, we got busted so heavily. I mean, after the first month, we got busted 3 times a week, because we was on as a 7-day-a-week station, first of all. And we got busted so heavily that in the end we decided to go down to just a 3-day-a-week station because we could maintain a weekend station.
It didn't take long for the major record labels to discover the influence Rare Groove was having on the London club scene. Soon, Rare Funk and Soul records were repackaged and re-released to a hungry market. James Brown, the Jackson Sisters and Maceo Parker all hit the charts in the 80s, decades after their original releases.
When Rare Groove first came along, before there were bunches of sort of Anaraki record dealers hopping off to obscure parts of the US to find unwanted copies and previously unsold copies of some of the classics, there were some key tracks such as Maceo and the Macs across the tracks, the Jackson Sisters, I Believe in Miracles, some obscure James Brown backing band JB productions that were extremely rare. They ultimately were all re-released, and the pioneering Rare Groove DJs moved on to other things. But it wasn't really about rarity. There were plenty of Rare Groove records that were played on that scene that were sort of currently released things. I mean, there was a certain amount of old school rap played, which you could readily go and buy in an import shop. It really wasn't about the individual records. It was about the bigger picture, the sort of musical whole that a good night out at a warehouse party represented.
You go through all the old thrift shops and the second-hand shops. If you were lucky enough in a record shop, you'd get a basement with a record in it. But there was so much vinyl out in America. There were tons. We'd go into like Watts' warehouse, and the guy would say, well, 7 inches, you want 7-inch singles? Like everyone was into 12 inches. America was going into Chicago House and Trax Records. So they'd say, we've got a room back here, like full of 7 inches. And you'd go in and it'd be a cavern, sort of 10, 12 foot high, 25 foot square, full of old singles boxes. And there were so many labels, and you just had to sort of go from labels. What label was that? Do I recognise the producer? If you found a box of 50, of course you'd go and stick it on your little battery record player and check it out and go, wow, right, we'll have all of those. But it was more like treasure hunting than record buying.
Fashions, though eclectic, were often old school in style. The hip-hop influence was strong and led to a passion for retro sportswear and trainers from the 70s, mixed with red-tag Levi 501s and the occasional tailored 70s style suit. Trainers like Adidas Superstars were worn with Fila tracksuit tops or American military chic.
Fashion at that point appealed to me a lot more than the previous club fashions. It was at the butt end of what was the Hard Times look, where, you know, everybody was trying to look like an extra from Angels with Dirty Faces. You know, they'd have these sort of 40s style leather jackets and distressed jeans and a butcher boy haircut. The Rare Groove thing coincided with a change. Everybody started wearing flight jackets. People started having their hair cut differently. Everyone was carrying around a Filofax. People would wear DM shoes and hoop socks, and it became this very, very defined London club fashion.
People wore 501s, faded usually, with either leather jackets or the sort of green bomber jackets, or then the MA1s came in, the black ones. Loads of trainers, old school trainers, although they weren't that old school then, but it was kind of, you know, Adidas Sheltos and Air Jordans, I think, became really massive then.
It was sort of a look with sort of like a cap, you know, with the flat caps on the side, slightly big, funky 70s flat caps.
There would be lots of styles coming in and out, some people be more influenced by hip hop at the time style, some a little bit more by rockabillys, you know, the leftover of the rockabilly or the mods or 60s scene. But it was all done for the time in a modern way.
It was always more than music. It was the look, the clothes, the going out, be seen at the right places. Well, not necessarily be seen by the right places by the wrong people, by people who were like you, who thought like you, who were into the same things as you were.
Loads of us had no money. Lots of people had a lot of money in the city, and this whole club culture that came about of the legends and the string fellas and all these places that wouldn't let us in because we didn't dress right or look right or have enough money to spend.
Half those clubs are naff anyway. Really, it's the Medallion Man gone wrong. So it's like, you keep that scene, we've got our own.
Groups of underground DJs and their sound systems established themselves by playing their music in warehouses and unorthodox West End nightclubs and restaurants. These illegal parties became the alternative to the mainstream London nightclub scene.
A lot of what our scene was about, in addition to the music, was a reaction to the really sort of antiquated licensing laws that existed both in London and the rest of the country at the time. Clubs in London all shut at 3 if they were lucky, and pretty much no club outside London shut any later than 2. We shut when the people dictated we shut.
Organisations like Shaken Finger Pop, Family Function, The Special Branch and Jazzy B's Soul to Soul built massive underground followings and gave birth to a new wave of groups playing funk with a contemporary slant.
I remember the parties very well. The parties were all incredible. It was during a period of time where everything was brand new, and you know, we ruled the world as most young people tend to feel they do. And no one had any inhibitions in those days. Everybody was free-spirited, really into having a good time. You know, it really was. It was groundbreaking days, as it were.
That feeling of being in a club that you could wear what you like and do what you like. Remember, the whole club scene had turned into a very tacky place, you know. Had to wear ties and jackets and, you know, what was all that about? So there was a need for kids to find a place where they could dress how they dressed.
You turn up at the venue, and usually it was just like a doorway with someone standing there, and it would just be concrete and white walls but with banners on them, but you wouldn't be able to lean against the walls because usually they'd been painted or they were so hot and sweaty that all the paint was coming off or the putty or whatever. And just brilliant. It was just like a real secret den, a real secret sort of hideaway, and it just felt like it was your vibe.
I mean, I remember many evenings wandering round Old Street and Hoxton, and you'd just find these parties going on because there was so much disused warehouse space around that area. You know, you'd get some address, you wouldn't know what you'd end up with. You know, it could be an old banana warehouse, could be an office block, could be someone's house, you never knew.
There was always an element of nerves about what we were doing because ultimately our parties could be busted by the police, were busted on a couple of occasions, although were successful on a great deal more. And if your party didn't take place, there was a good deal of money to lose. You'd invested in the bar, flyer printing, you were paying a bunch of people on the night. If it didn't work out, there was a great deal of money to be lost, and we weren't making that much money that we could afford to swallow a succession of losses.
The illegal parties, and the success with them was really basically they had no closing time. The closing time was basically when the police turned up and either shut you down or that people just were dwindling off at about 8 in the morning or whatsoever. There you were free to do anything you wanted, really. If you wanted to take drugs, you could take drugs. And if you wanted to drink, as long as you wanted to drink, you could drink. And the main thing was that people were really into this freedom and they weren't really abusing it either.
During the warehouse party scene with all the rare groove stuff, there wasn't ecstasy around. Cocaine wasn't as big as it became. So it was a very, very kind of, you know, there's a bit of smoke about, but that was it.
You didn't have any sort of ecstasy or cocaine or anything like that. It just wasn't necessary. I mean, for most people, it was a can of warm lager and a spliff.
So much wasn't about drugs. So much wasn't about drugs. It was about the music and having a good time. It was about the release being in that place gave you.
I think the integration of the whole movement was important, you know, bringing black and white people together, which is why Soul to Soul's philosophy is a happy face, a thumping bass for a loving race.
In my opinion, the rare groove scene wasn't really destined to last for any great length of time because of the nature of the fact that it was retro music for a start. Also, the time that it came around, really it was kind of strong between, I guess, like really 86 to the sort of 88, middle of 88. And you had so much good music coming out from, like, hip-hop at that time was pretty good, and then you had house music, which totally sort of blew the whole thing apart. And it was weird, towards the tail end of the sort of rare groove thing, although we didn't know it was the end of it, it did feel as though it was a very sort of flat period and things got very, when you get that kind of calm before the storm sort of feeling.
The rare groove really evolved into, I think a lot of people involved in the scene, people that were DJing, people that were going to the clubs, evolved into the beginnings of acid jazz as such, the beginnings of groups forming together and making music, then bands like Young Disciples, like our own band, Pressure Drop, we've started making music around 1990. And it evolved into a whole scene of a British soul scene of another dimension that still exists today.
On a musical basis, the rare groove sound has influenced an awful lot of commercially very successful types of music, particularly R&B and hip-hop, and has done so for the past 15 years.
It's that era that's left a lasting impression on Londoners, because many of the people who went to those parties originally went on to become the biggest movers and players and shakers behind the whole burgeoning acid house scene and the acid jazz scene.
Although Rare Groove only illuminated the London club scene for a short period, it provided some of the biggest contemporary DJs and record producers their initial platform. However, events conspired against Rare Groove as the second summer of love swamped London with the ecstasy-fueled acid house explosion. But funk, soul and jazz were destined to reappear only a year or so later with the birth of acid jazz.